Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going deep on something I think every parent thinks about at some point, and that's helping your kids be amazing problem solvers. I'm thinking about this because when I was a kid, I remember one time I was building this big, huge Lego castle, and I couldn't quite get the drawbridge to work the way I wanted it to. I was getting frustrated. I was about ready to give up, and my dad came over. And he sat down with me, and we just started playing with it. We tried different things, and eventually we got it to work just the way I wanted it to. And it was like this light bulb went off in my head where I realized, like, problem solving isn't just a magical thing that you either can do or you can't do. It's actually a skill that you can develop. It's like having the right tools and knowing how to use them.
That's such a great analogy, and it's interesting how often we get caught up in the specific academics and things that we think of as like educational, but really problem solving is such a foundational life skill. It impacts how kids approach challenges in school, their relationships, how they make decisions as they grow up. And I think for the listener, I'd even challenge you to think about your own life. How often do you face situations where you need to get creative and find a solution for something?
Oh my gosh, all the time. Whether it's like meeting a work deadline or figuring out what to make for dinner when you haven't been at the grocery store, or even just like trying to get dressed in the morning when it's kind of a weird weather day. I mean, it's like constantly problem solving is happening.
Exactly. And as the world is changing so rapidly,
Mm.
we can't predict the challenges that our kids are going to face. But what we can do is equip them with the ability to think flexibly and adapt to different situations and find solutions to whatever obstacles they encounter.
So it's not really just about solving that one math problem or figuring out that one tricky puzzle. It's about building like this mental framework that can be applied to just about anything.
You got it. And the source material that we're looking at today does a really good job of breaking this down into what they call like puzzle pieces of problem solving. And I think those are super digestible and actionable for parents.
I love that. Like breaking down problems into smaller steps. That just seems so crucial because sometimes you just feel so overwhelmed and you're like, wait a minute, I can't even get started. But if you can take that giant monster of a problem and break it down into these smaller chunks, it suddenly seems a lot more manageable.
Absolutely. And I think about that in terms of parenting too, because instead of saying, clean your room, which to a kid can seem like, oh my gosh, where do I even begin? You can say, okay, let's just start with putting all of the clothes in the hamper. And then suddenly it feels achievable and they get that sense of accomplishment and can move on to the next step.
And speaking of kind of taking things step by step, another thing that the source material really highlighted was the importance of thinking like a detective. And this just reminded me of like reading those classic mystery novels where it's all about gathering clues and retracing your steps and kind of piecing together the information to figure out the solution.
And it's fascinating because those are actually tapping into some pretty fundamental cognitive processes.
Yeah.
We have deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. So thinking about deductive reasoning, if you know that all dogs bark and you know that Spot is a dog, well, you can deduce that Spot barks.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. What about inductive reasoning?
So inductive reasoning is kind of the flip side of that, where you're observing specific instances and then from that drawing a general conclusion. So let's say you notice that every time you eat spicy food, you get heartburn. You might inductively reason that spicy food causes you heartburn.
So when we're encouraging our kids to think like a detective, we're actually helping them to use these reasoning skills.
Exactly. And the more practice they get, the better they become at identifying patterns, evaluating evidence, and forming logical conclusions.
And sometimes you need more than just logic. Sometimes you need that spark of creativity. And the source material really emphasized how important it is to encourage kids to think outside the box.
I love that because creative thinking is all about generating new ideas, exploring different perspectives, and coming up with novel solutions.
And it's a feeling of when you're kind of stuck on something and then suddenly you have this breakthrough and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think of that before.
Yeah, those aha moments are so powerful for kids. And it really shows them that they have that ability to think differently and to come up with their own solutions.
This is so fascinating, but I'm really curious to see how these puzzle pieces kind of come together in a real world situation.
Yeah, let's get into that. So the source actually gives us this perfect example of a flat tire on the way to the park. So picture this. You're in the car with your family, everybody's excited, you're headed to the park for the day, and suddenly you hear that thump, thump, thunk sound of a flat tire.
Oh no.
Yeah, it's the perfect real-world problem-solving opportunity. And in the source, the parent really uses this as a teaching moment. So instead of immediately jumping in and taking charge, the parent turns to the child and says, we have a flat tire. What do you think we should do?
I love that.
Hmm.
Getting the kid involved right away makes them feel like they're a part of the solution instead of just, along for the ride.
Absolutely. And the child in the story suggests, well, let's call a tow truck, which is a perfectly valid solution. But the parent sees this as a chance to think about some other options and says, that's a great idea, but what if we try to change the tire ourselves first? Do you remember what we need to do that?
It's so good because they're not dismissing the child's idea, but they are encouraging them to think a little more broadly about what the possibilities are.
Exactly. And it kind of goes back to that thinking like a detective skill that we were talking about. And so the child remembers, oh, yeah, we need the spare tire, the jack, and the lug wrench.
So they're already starting to use those problem-solving skills,
Mhm.
thinking about the resources that are needed.
Yeah. And they're doing it together. It's collaborative. It's fun. And so the parent guides the child in finding each of those things in the trunk of the car. It's like a little treasure hunt.
It's amazing how something that can be really frustrating can actually be turned into a learning experience.
It's all in how you frame it.
Sure.
It's a challenge that you and your child can tackle together. And as
Yeah.
they go through the steps, the parent is explaining everything and encouraging the child to think critically about why things are done in a particular order.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, like why do we loosen the lug nuts before we jack up the car? Things like that.
So it's not just about like doing the steps, it's about understanding the why behind them.
Right. And I also love that this scenario shows that it's okay to not get everything perfect on the first try. The parent actually makes a little mistake along the way, but owns it and adjusts the approach.
Which is such a good lesson for kids to see because it normalizes making mistakes. And, it's okay to kind of shift gears if you need to as you're learning.
Absolutely. And it also highlights the importance of persistence. They didn't give up when they hit a little snag. They kept going, and ultimately they were successful. They fixed the tire and they got to go to the park and have their fun day.
It really drives home the point that this isn't just about changing a tire. It's about learning a process that can be applied to just about any problem.
You got it. And this all connects to this amazing world of cognitive skills that really form the foundation of effective problem solving. And these are like the mental tools that we use to break down those challenges, analyze the information, and come up with solutions.
Okay, so let's dig into those cognitive skills. It feels like we're getting into the real nuts and bolts of how our brains actually work to solve problems.
We are. And the source material highlights a few that are super important for kids and also for you as parents to understand. So one of them is analytical thinking. And we've already touched on this a little bit with breaking down problems into smaller parts.
Right, like that whole clean your room example. It just feels so much less overwhelming when you can tackle it one step at a time.
Exactly. And what's happening in your child's brain when they do that is they're learning to kind of dissect that problem, understand all the different pieces of it and how those pieces relate to each other.
So it's not just about dividing and conquering, it's about understanding the structure of the problem itself.
Exactly. And then there's critical thinking, which is all about evaluating information, questioning assumptions, and making those smart judgments.
Oh,
It's
okay.
what allows us to say, all right, there might be a few different ways to solve this, but which one is going to be the most effective, the safest, the most logical?
Yeah, that makes sense because thinking back to the flat tire example, it wasn't enough to just know that they needed a spare tire. They had to figure out the correct way to use that jack and the lug wrench to actually change it.
Right. And that's critical thinking in action. It's not just having the knowledge, it's applying it effectively. And of course, we can't forget about creative thinking.
Oh yeah, that think outside the box piece of the puzzle. This one always feels a little more mysterious to me. Is it something you can actually teach, or is it more like an innate talent?
That's a great question. And researchers actually believe that while some people may be naturally more inclined towards creative thinking, it's definitely a skill that can be developed.
Oh, interesting.
And one of the best ways to do that is to encourage kids to experiment, to play with different ideas, and to not be afraid to make mistakes.
So it's really about fostering an environment where they feel safe to explore all those what-if possibilities without feeling like they're going to be judged.
Exactly. Think about that Lego drawbridge challenge that you were talking about earlier. I bet you tried a bunch of different approaches before you figured out what worked, and some of them probably seemed a little out there.
Oh, totally. I remember using rubber bands and paper clips. Like that was definitely not in the instruction manual,
Mm.
but it helped me to think about the problem in a different way.
And that's the beauty of it. Those seemingly silly attempts often spark these unexpected insights and lead to those innovative solutions. But there's one more cognitive skill that's often overlooked, and that's persistence.
This one feels so important, especially in a world where, Kids are just surrounded by instant gratification. It's so easy to just give up when things get tough.
It is, and that's why it's even more crucial for us to be intentional about nurturing that sense of persistence in our children. It's about teaching them that setbacks are normal, that it's okay to struggle, and that the feeling of accomplishment that you get when you finally overcome a challenge is so rewarding.
It's like that saying, it's not about how many times you fall down, it's about how many times you get back up.
Exactly. And when you think about it, every successful person, every innovator, every problem solver out there has faced their fair share of setbacks along the way. But the difference is that they didn't let those setbacks define them. They persisted, they adapted, and they kept learning and growing.
Wow, this deep dive has been amazing. We went from understanding the basic building blocks of problem solving to really exploring the powerful cognitive skills that make it all possible.
Yeah, it's been a fun journey.
And I think the key takeaway here is that as parents, we have this incredible opportunity to empower our kids with these skills, to nurture those problem-solving abilities, and really set them up for success in all areas of their lives.
Couldn't agree more. It's about fostering a mindset of curiosity, resilience, and creative exploration.
So as we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you with a little challenge. What's one opportunity you can create this week to tackle a problem with your child using some of the puzzle pieces that we've talked about? Maybe it's building something together. Maybe it's figuring out a strategy for a game. Maybe it's even just navigating a little household hiccup. The key is to approach it as a team with that sense of curiosity and adventure. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive, and until next time, keep those problem-solving muscles flexed.